Hey everyone, Dan Johnston here. I'm the Jack of all Ministries, and today I'm going to give you part 2 of studio building jargon. So the last video I put out, I gave you a whole list of terms that I thought would be helpful to you as you're researching your home studio or whatever, because I had a lot of trouble trying to figure out what a lot of these terms meant as I was doing my own research myself. So again, I wanted to create something that was very simple, something that you could go back to or even leave open as you do other research, because, undoubtedly, if you're learning this stuff, you're going to come across some terms that are confusing. It'll take a while to learn, and it can be a little bit challenging to go back and forth. So I figured I'd give you one thing you could go back to, listen to these definitions, kind of give you a blanket idea of what's going on to help you figure out what you're going to do for your own application. So to start off this video, I want to begin with the subject of room modes. Now, basically what a room mode is it's a list of frequencies that are going to give you some pressure problems in your room. And what that means is that you may go to a certain point of the room and you may hear a frequency that's a lot louder than is what's really coming out of your speakers, or it may be a lot quieter than what's coming out of your speakers. In fact, you may not hear it at all at that particular frequency. And so it's important to figure out what room modes are at the beginning of your building process so that you can figure out what room modes you're going to go after and treat, because we're talking about low frequency issues in general. And so if you're going to be dealing with those, it can be a lot more complicated than just treating the high frequency stuff. And we'll get into that a little bit more as we go on. But basically what you need to know is that room modes are a list of frequencies that are going to give you problems. Now, room modes are basically split up into 3 different things. You have axial room modes, tangential room modes, and oblique room modes. Now, what this is basically it's an interaction between the sound waves between either 2 walls, and that's your axial mode. It's basically one-dimensional because you're talking about the connection between 2 walls. You have tangential room modes, which basically use 4 surfaces in your 6-surfaced room. And basically those are about half as strong, okay? And then you also have your oblique room mode, and basically that is when all 6 surfaces are coming into play. And if you've ever played racquetball, and you've ever played somebody good and they kind of hit the ball into the corner and it'll hit one wall and then another wall and then the floor all in kind of one shot, well, that's basically what an oblique room mode does. It hits all 3 walls and then goes up and hits the other 3 walls in the opposite corner using all 6 surfaces. And those oblique room modes are only about a quarter as strong as your axial room modes, which are the strongest. So what's happening with your room modes is you're dealing with something called a stationary or a standing wave. And basically what happens is the wavelength of that frequency is divisible by the length of your room. So let me give you an example. Say you have a wall in your room that is a 20-foot length, okay? Well, the frequency at 56.5 hertz is also 20 feet long. So that means if you play the frequency 56.5 in that room, there's a good chance that you are going to have a room mode there. And depending on where you're standing, you're either going to hear too much of that sound or too little of that sound in comparison to what's actually going on in the room. Now, the video that I put out next, I'm going to dedicate specifically to talking about standing waves because it's a little bit complicated, but it's really, really interesting, and I'm really looking forward to the opportunity about teaching what I've learned about standing waves. But just for simplicity's sake, what you need to know is that it just creates different pockets in your room of high pressure and low pressure that is basically lying to your ears, if you will. Now, normal waves in your room are called traveling waves because they travel back and forth between your walls, and they get so mixed up that no matter where you stand, there's kind of an even consistency of the waves in the room, and so you don't actually hear too much or too little artificially in the room. Now, with a standing wave, though, because it's divisible, you get these points where the standing wave is actually accentuating and then going down to nothing. And so in this animation that I'm going to show you, you'll see that you have a sound wave going one direction, and then it bounces off the back wall and comes back, and as it's going, it creates this interesting pattern. Now, at this point of the wave, where you have 2 high pressure zones kind of coming together from the same frequency, you'll see that this other wave swings up really, really high, which essentially doubles the SPL. It doubles the amount of sound that you can hear if you're standing at that point in the room. But as the wave travels on, you'll see that it flattens out. And there you'll see, remember phase canceling, we talked about that in the first video, and so you won't hear it. But because it's swinging back and forth, you are hearing the louder version of it, and that's basically what you're interpreting. But notice that there are also these other zones along the wave where there is absolutely no motion at all. The sound keeps going and traveling back and forth forever, but there is never a high or a low pressure change at that point. And so you can sit there all day long and you will never hear that frequency at all. Now, the point where you don't hear anything is called a node, and you may have, two of these basically just at the walls, or you may have several of them across the room. At the point where the pressures double up on each other, this is called the antinode. And this is important to know because when you're treating this kind of a thing, remember, if you're trying to stop air molecules from moving, at the node, the air molecules aren't going to be moving very much, and so putting sound treatment there isn't as helpful as putting it in the antinode, where there is a lot of pressure swing and therefore a lot of molecular movement. Now, basically, figuring out your room modes ahead of time is very handy because it gives you an idea of what you're going to have to treat. Now, it's not universal because, remember, there are all these sound waves bouncing in all these different directions, so even though you're at a point which would be the node for a particular frequency, the fact that that same frequency is bouncing off of all of the other dimensions of the room may actually fill up that space, and so you may actually not hear anything at all. But because if you're standing somewhere which is an axial mode, that's why you have to measure it later to see actually how things ended up playing out. Also, standing waves are based on the idea that you're using a wall that is perfectly reflective. If you are absorbing that or it's being transmitted through the wall, then the returning wave is weaker, and so the phase cancellation isn't as absolute, and so you may not actually have a perfect node where you don't hear anything. So how do you figure out what your room modes are going to be? Well, as I mentioned, this has to do with wavelengths matching the length of the walls in your room. And so basically, if you want to figure out what your axial modes are, which I would recommend doing first, because if you treat your axial modes, because the tangential and oblique modes are weaker, those usually just follow suit if you can treat the axial modes. And so if you can figure out what your axial modes are, you want to actually figure it out for the width of your room, the length of your room, and also the height of your room. And so you'll know exactly what you're treating. So just as an example, we'll use our 20-foot wall again. We know that 56.5 hertz is going to be our room mode because it's equal, but that's not the lowest frequency that we have to worry about. And the reason why is because a half wavelength is also considered a room mode, and the reason why is because, remember, a sound wave is a neutral pressure point that goes to high pressure, down through neutral, down to low pressure, and then back up to neutral again. That's one wavelength. Now, if it goes from neutral to high to neutral again, basically at that point, it starts to reflect back the same way, and then we run into a room mode problem again, but the nodes are only at the walls at that point. And so that is our lowest possible frequency where we're going to have a room mode, and that is called the fundamental. So in our example, if you take a 20-foot wall and you figure out what your room modes are going to be, your lowest one is going to be 28.25 hertz. That's half a wavelength in your room. Now, what you can do then is you take that lowest frequency, your fundamental, and you can just multiply it. And every time you multiply it by a bigger number, you write that frequency down, and that's going to give you a list of your harmonic frequencies, your harmonic room modes. And so basically, you have the 28.25 hertz is going to be your half wavelength in your room. 56.5 hertz is going to be a full wavelength in your room. Then you go up to 84.75, and that's 1.5 wavelengths in your room. Then you go up to 113 hertz, and that's going to be 2 full wavelengths in your room. And so as you increase, you're actually adding more nodes and antinodes into your room. But basically, once you get above a certain frequency, these problems are a lot easier to treat because their energy types change, and we'll get into that in just a little bit. The next thing I want to talk to you guys about is types of treatment. Now that we know that there are pressure issues within a room that can come in the form of room modes or standing waves, it's important to talk about the types of treatment we might use to fix some of those problems. The first terms I want to mention to you are pressure or wave energy, and then also I want to contrast that with ray energy. Now basically, pressure or wave energy is something that is really a description of all sound waves, but there's a certain point where the pressure becomes a bigger issue for the sound that you're trying to treat. Now, what do I mean by that? Remember, a sound wave is just a series of pressure pulses going from high to low pressure. And then those pressure waves excite the air molecules, and that's what we interpret as sound. But pressure can also be an issue in and of itself. That's why you can kind of feel that bass in your chest and things like that, because it's the pressure affecting your body. Now, sometimes the pressure becomes so great that trying to stop the air molecules is basically futile, and we need to do something to treat the pressure within a room. In higher frequencies where the pressure isn't so much of an issue, we call that ray energy, because you can basically treat it like a ray gun where you're shooting a line and it's going to reflect and bounce off the walls the way you would expect. But at lower frequencies, it begins to become a pressure issue, and so we call it pressure or wave energy, because now it's not just like a laser bouncing off the walls. Now you're talking about much bigger issues with, diffraction comes into the picture, and then you start to get into your room modes and things like that. That brings up our next term, which is the Schroeder frequency. And basically what this is this is the point in your room where you're going to stop worrying about ray energy and you're going to start worrying about treating a frequency like wave or pressure energy. Now, the way that you figure out what your Schroeder frequency is you're going to take your reverb time in seconds, not milliseconds, in seconds, and divide it by your room volume in cubic meters. Now, once you've divided that, then you square root it, and then you multiply it by 2,000, and that's going to give you a frequency. For my room, it's about 257 hertz. And so basically, anytime I need to treat a frequency above 257 hertz, I can treat it like ray energy and just basically treat it with basic, treatment on the walls. Where anything 257 and below, if I have a room mode there, I need to use pressure absorption, because it's going to do a much more efficient job at controlling the issues in the room. Friction absorbers, or velocity or porous absorption. Basically what this is the typical studio foam type stuff that you see put on the walls to stop sound, okay? It's the idea of putting something on the wall that is porous, that is going to stop the air molecules from moving. Remember, a sound wave is a series of high and low pressure pulses, essentially, that are exciting air molecules around them. And so a porous absorber basically catches those air molecules that are moving and stops them from vibrating. Now, a particular type of velocity absorber that's a little bit misleading that you might come across when you're doing research is called a bass trap. Now, if you're like me, when I first started doing research, when I heard the term bass trap, my first thought was I pictured people getting these wedges of foam and shoving them into the corners of the room, because that's going to stop all the bass that is building up in the corners. Now, there is some truth to this idea of bass building up in corners, but actually a bass trap that works is really something where you'd be using a pressure absorber, because remember, when you get below that line of your Schroeder frequency or your room crossover, that's where you want to start treating with pressure absorption to stop the pressure, and velocity absorbers only work to stop the air molecules from moving. And so when you put a bass trap in the corner, it's usually not going to stop the bass, because the molecular movement and the pressure is just too great. And so that's basically just porous absorption, which is going to stop the higher frequencies in your corner. Now, putting something that's going to stop a significantly moving wave into the corner of your room or up against the wall isn't always the best technique. That's why if you do research, you'll see a lot of guys will put an airspace behind their velocity absorbers to make their absorption a little bit more efficient. And the reason why is because, remember, when I talked about standing waves, I talked about these things called nodes, or a space where the vibration is not actually freely taking place. It's actually sitting there pretty neutral and not moving at all. This is what happens exactly at the surface of a wall. If you've ever been to a rock concert and you picture kind of a mosh pit going up towards the front, and the action of that mosh pit is pushing like these people and these little kids up against the railing up at the front. It wouldn't make any sense to yell at the kids and say, "Hey, little kids, stop moving," right? Because the issue is all the people behind them that have room to move in their mosh pit that's pushing them into this barricade. And so basically the same thing happens in our room when it comes to absorption. When the pressure wave is coming at the wall, it's pushing those air molecules into the wall, and so they don't actually have any space to move. And so when you put a velocity absorber in a space where the air molecules aren't moving all that much, it's not very efficient. You're actually better off at moving that that the absorbent material towards an antinode where the actual wave is moving a lot more, and so the molecular movement is going to be, significantly greater distances, and so you're better off trying to trap it there. Now, that doesn't mean that bass traps aren't something that is useful. Really, when you think about a bass trap, what you actually want to do is you want to build a pressure absorber, and that's because treating lower frequencies is a lot more efficient when you stop the pressure of the wave rather than the molecular movement. Now, there's a couple of names for the treatment that you would use for pressure treatment in a room. The first one is diaphragmatic or flexural absorption. The next one is a Helmholtz absorber, and then the next one is a membrane absorber, and then there's also something that's like a tube trap. And when I say tube trap, I'm not talking about the ones where you can go online and buy a tube trap, which is just essentially a porous absorber in the shape of a tube, but we'll get to that in just a little bit. A diaphragmatic or flexural absorber is basically something where you're going to build a box and you're going to put a diaphragmatic plate, if you will, in the front of this thing. Okay, so you can kind of think of like a drum actually, where it's a sealed space where you have a membrane type thing at the front, but this is typically going to be something like MDF or plywood or something like that, where you want it to actually resonate and pick up the frequency. Now, there's a term called sympathy or sympathetic vibration. And what this refers to is if you have a frequency, we'll call it 150 hertz. If you build an object that wants to vibrate at 150 hertz, it'll suck that 150 hertz energy out of the air because the pressure of that sound is actually being used to start your absorber to start vibrating, so it diminishes the energy. And so a diaphragmatic absorber actually has a plate that will absorb, and then inside this sealed box, there's going to be something that's going to dampen that vibration. It's going to absorb any molecular movement, and then also there's even a sense of adding low pressure into this box. So because it's sealed, that low pressure prevents sound from actually being able to be heard. If you'll realize that sound can't be heard in space, that's because the pressure moving through space doesn't have any air molecules to excite, so we can't hear it. And so if you put a low pressure, or essentially a small vacuum, into a box, it's actually going to prevent that sound from being able to be heard. The next one is called a membrane absorber, and basically what you do is you're going to build a membrane. Oftentimes this is made out of like mass-loaded vinyl or something like that, and it would probably be suspended so it kind of floats into the room, and these are actually cut to a certain size so it will vibrate in sympathy with those certain pressure waves. And so when those start vibrating, again, it sucks that pressure or that energy out of the air to lower the amount of energy that's being exerted into making sound in your room. The next one is called a Helmholtz absorber. Okay. The next one is called a Helmholtz. Okay. The next one is called a Helmholtz absorber. The next one is called a Helmholtz. Man, this is hard to say. The next one is a Helmholtz absorber. And basically, the most common example that you'll see of this is if somebody gets like a beer bottle or something like that, and they blow across it and it resonates at a certain pitch, and then you can add or take away, the fluid from the bottle, and it's going to change the frequency of it. Well, basically what happens is that bottle wants to vibrate at a certain frequency. And so if you took a bottle like that, put it in a room, whatever frequency it wants to vibrate at, if that frequency is in the room, it's going to suck the energy out of that frequency out of the air and lower that sound. Now, something the size of a beer bottle isn't going to be very efficient. But the nice thing about it is Helmholtz absorbers are actually very specific in the frequencies that you go after. So if you have a particular problem at 250 hertz and you can build a Helmholtz absorber to actually reduce that out of the air, then it's going to only take that frequency out of the air, and it's not going to actually damage any of the other frequencies and lower their amplitude in the room as well. Now, you won't find a lot of Helmholtz absorbers in studios and stuff like that. The places you'll see them a lot are like industrial settings and stuff like that. They're commonly put in car exhaust and things like that in the auto industry because you can actually basically tune the sound of the exhaust in your car so it sounds really good because you're pulling out the frequencies that you don't want and allowing the ones that you do want to stay in there. The last one that I want to mention is a tube trap. And now there's a brand out there that actually has their own tube traps, and it's called a tube trap. And that's not what I'm talking about. I'm actually talking about an article that I read where if you take a tube of something, you can actually cut the length of it to match the wavelength that you're trying to eliminate, and it'll pinpoint essentially that frequency. And so I decided that I was going to do that in my room. I wanted to try it out. But if you think about it, if I wanted to eliminate 56 hertz from my room, I'd have to have a 20-foot long tube in my room. And it's also, according to theory, the bigger diameter you put on the tube, the more amplitude it'll actually take out of the air, the more attenuation there will be. So basically, you're talking about making a monstrous tube if you really want to eliminate, something in the 50 hertz range or whatever. But the article also said that you could actually do a half wavelength if you seal up one end. And so I took a concrete form, sealed up one end, and did it for 2 frequencies in my room, and I wanted to see how well it worked. And I did it for 125 hertz, and I did it for 200 hertz, and I just wanted to see how well it was going to work. And in the end, that design actually did very little to change the SPL levels in my room. So there's still, the peaks and valleys that I had there to begin with are still there. But it actually seemed to have a huge impact on my RT60. If you look at this graph here, you can see that those 2 frequencies actually came down quite a bit, and it's significant because it's basically 2 points that came down. But I also had a drop around 80 hertz, and I'm not sure exactly where that came from. I did add other treatment into the room as I did that, so maybe that was just a lucky thing. So I'm not sure, but that was an article that I read, and it seemed that it's pretty true to form. So the next section I want to talk to you about is the measurement section. And this is talking about the different ways that we measure our room in the planning phase and then in the treatment phase, both to figure out what we're going to treat and then to see if the treatment that we've decided to use is actually going to work. And so I want to start by talking about something called the bolt area. And basically, all the examples that I'm going to be using for the measurement section, I'm either going to be looking at REW, which is Room EQ Wizard, which is free software, or I'm going to be looking at the AMROC Room Mode Calculator, because that's also a free software you can get online, or just use it online and then figure out what your room modes are going to be and stuff like that. So I want to start by looking at the bolt area, and basically this is one of the golden ratio calculations, and what a golden ratio is basically looking at the height and the width and the length of your room to figure out what ratios are the best in terms of eliminating the room modes that we talked about before, or rather than eliminating them, actually keeping them a certain distance apart. Because once you get room modes that are actually getting too close to each other, it's a lot harder to treat. And so there's this golden ratio idea, and everybody has a different idea of what that's going to be. But the bolt area gives you kind of one of those room ratio calculations to where you want to pick the dimensions of your room so that they fit within that bolt area window, which makes treating your axial modes and stuff like that later on makes it a little bit easier. So if you're using the AMROC room calculator, what you can do is put in your dimensions, and then you want this little X to land within this little kind of lake-shaped shape in the middle. If it lands in the middle, it gives you a better chance of having a good ratio in your room that's going to make your modes easier to treat later on down the road. So the next thing we'll see is the Bonello Criteria, which actually talks about the number of modes per third octave. And that really, again, is a golden ratio type thing where you want to keep the number of modes within that 1/3 of an octave kind of steadily increasing as you go up. So it kind of ensures that you have even spacing as your frequencies get higher in your room, which again keeps those frequencies separated enough to where when you're actually treating them, it makes eliminating your modes down the road a lot easier. Measurement microphones. I know I said that I wasn't going to talk about mics and stuff like that in this video, but because we're talking about the building process and the treating process, I felt like measurement mics were kind of the exception, because if you're doing research about doing measurements and you hear a measurement microphone, you might not even know what that is. And so basically, a measurement mic is just a microphone that is tuned to have a very flat frequency response, and is usually omnidirectional, so it kind of hears everything in every direction. And so what you do is you get some room measurement software, and usually you're going to either play noise, which covers the frequency spectrum, or you're going to play a sweep, which goes from low frequency up to high frequency. And so basically you're putting every single possible frequency into your room. And what happens is then the measurement microphone will listen to what the sound does in the room, and it's going to say, "Hey, you know what? I know that the speakers played, you know, 150 hertz at 90 decibels, but it sounds like 85 decibels over here when, 3000 hertz actually sounds like 100 decibels when it was played at 95." So when you're measuring it, you can hear what the SPL level is in your room. Also, it tracks reverb time, so it sees how long it takes for that frequency to actually decay into nothing. And so measurement microphones are a really useful tool. Now you can use any microphone to do this, but the problem is if the mic is kind of tuned to have a higher frequency response in the highs, or if it's more tuned for the lows, or it cuts out the mids, or whatever profile that mic has is going to show up in your measurement. And so it's a good idea to have a microphone that is just flat neutral, and it's going to pick up as much frequency, as many frequencies as possible to give you an accurate result of what your room actually sounds like. Now, for me, I went out and bought this microphone from Dayton Audio. It was pretty inexpensive. It was less than $70. It works great. It had a lot of really good reviews. I know Behringer has one that is kind of the workhorse of the industry, or whatever, that a lot of people use. Now, this is the EMM6, which is, just a regular XLR microphone, but you can also get versions that come with USB, so you can just plug it right into your computer and you don't have to worry about going through an interface or anything like that. But measurement microphones are really useful to have, and definitely worth the money. Noise floor. This is a useful piece of information to have when you're trying to figure out things about soundproofing. Okay, this is basically talking about what the ambient noise is in a certain area when you're trying to soundproof. So for example, in my house, outside in the afternoon, I know that the ambient noise, or the noise floor, is somewhere around 45 decibels. And basically that means that if I'm trying to soundproof something, there's always going to be 45 decibels of sound outside. So once the sound transmission coming out of my studio gets below, 45 decibels, then there's really no way for me to know how much more transmission I'm blocking, because I'm always going to hear 45 decibels because that's how loud it is outside. And so knowing your noise floor gives you kind of a low number that you can shoot for. Noise reduction coefficient, or the NRC. Basically, this is a rating that you will see on different types of products that will tell you how good they are at reducing the noise of something. It may be referred to as an absorption coefficient. And so basically, this is a standard set of results that gives you an answer somewhere between 0.0 and 1.0, and that tells you how much sound energy it absorbs when a wave hits that material. Now, nothing is perfectly at a 0. I think concrete is even like 0.05 or 0.5 or something like that. But basically, everything has a rate at which it absorbs something. Now, if it completely takes that sound wave and eliminates the reflection, then it has an absorption coefficient of 1.0. If it's reflecting it, completely, and the entire wave bounces off, then it's 0. And so that's helpful to know when you're looking up the difference between, is this foam going to be better than this mineral wool? Is that going to be better than this fabric, or whatever you're looking at? So everything has an absorption coefficient, and it's good information to have when you're trying to figure out what materials you want to use to absorb sound. Sound Transmission Class, or STC. This is another rating system that was made for the construction industry to give an idea about how well different materials and arrangements actually soundproof when you're building something new. Now, because this was made for the construction industry, where they're building, apartments where they're worried about, hearing conversations from your neighbor next door, this rating scale is not all encompassing about a material's ability to dampen sound. So it doesn't do anything for low frequencies, because it's hard to stop low frequencies, so there's no point in putting that as a construction standard. So basically, what they did was they took 16 frequencies at 1/3 of an octave, and it bounces all the way up from 125 hertz up to 4,000 hertz. So basically, if you're worried about what your material will do 4,000 and above, or 125 and below, STC will not take that into account. the way that this works is if you have an STC rating of, say, 32, it's not necessarily true that you're going to get 32 decibels of reduction, because basically this is graded on a curve, if you will. And so the way that this works is they'll take those 16 frequencies and you find out how your material performs in terms of the decibel reduction for each one of those frequencies. But then you have to line it up with a curve, and basically no one of those frequencies can have any more than 8 decibels of deviation from that standard curve. Also, you can't have any more than a total of 32 deviations from that curve. So basically, it's possible that you may have something that, for all intents and purposes, would be an STC of 50, but if you have one frequency that actually performs really poorly by having more than 8 decibels reduction, you would have to lower the STC rating. I found that out when I was finding out the STC results when I tested green glue versus carpet glue, and that was the situation for green glue. It made it look like the STC level was, about 4 points lower than it actually was according to my test, which seems unfair, but that's the way that it works. So even though it's not 100% accurate, STC is still very useful to give you a general idea of how your materials will work when it comes to soundproofing. Just keep in mind that it does not account for low frequency response below 125 hertz. And the last thing I want to mention in the measurement section is RT60. And there's a couple of other terms that are going to go along with that, but it's all based around RT60. There are also plenty of other measurement terms that I could put into this, but I feel like these kind of encompass the need for, basic knowledge of these terms. So basically, RT60 is reverb time, and then the 60 refers to a decibel drop of 60 decibels. So what does that mean? So if you're measuring the reverb in your room, you have an initial sound and then how long it takes to decay. So if you're trying to eliminate reverb, you want a short reverb time. And so basically, if you played a sound in your room at, say, 90 decibels, you're going to measure how long it takes for that 90 decibel sound to reverb and then decay down to about 30 decibels. Okay, that's a 60 decibel drop. So the more RT60, the longer it takes for the reverb to go away. Smaller RT60 is the shorter time it takes for reverb to go away. Now, you may also see like T20, T30, something like that. And those are basically calculations that you use to figure out what your RT60 would be if you don't have enough sound to actually use to do that. Let's say you have a noise floor of 50 decibels and you're playing a sound at 70 decibels. Well, that's only a 20 decibel possible drop. So how could you even know how long it would take to drop 60 decibels because you don't have 60 decibels to work with? Well, you might use your T20 time, which would be how long does it take for that sound to drop 20 decibels, and then you take that number and you multiply it by 3, and that gives you an RT60 time using a calculation. Of course, it's not 100% accurate, but it's a pretty standard accepted practice when you're trying to measure something with data that you don't have. At the end of the last video, I gave everyone 2 weeks to kind of respond and give me some terms that they felt needed to be added into this video. And there's only 2 that I wanted to insert in here. The first one that I thought would be helpful is the term distortion. You might hear people talk about distortion, 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 and you might be thinking distortion like a guitar, like a distortion pedal. And in a sense, that's true. But when people are talking about distortion in a room, they're talking about taking a sound in its pure form and anything that would change it into something that it isn't actually supposed to be. So comb filtering is a form of distortion, right? Because you're taking the original sound and you're changing it into something that it was never actually supposed to be to begin with. So that's what distortion means. It's changing the original sound. The other term that I wanted to add is one called constrained layer damping, or sometimes referred to as constrained layer mass damping, or CLMD. This is what green glue does, or this is what, putting together mass-loaded vinyl up against drywall is. You're taking different layers of different types of mass so that you could treat different frequencies across the spectrum, because each material you use is going to have a different density, and it's going to play with the frequencies different from one another. And so when you use constrained layer mass damping, basically what you're doing is you're taking these layers and you're pressing them together, so you'll have like a layer of drywall, a layer of green glue, a layer of drywall, a layer of MLV, a layer of plywood, a layer of concrete, right? So these layers coming and being pressed together gives different surfaces and different densities. So when a sound wave goes through it, you may take out, a different set of frequencies in the first one, and then the second one will clean up the ones that the first one didn't get. Putting them all together is actually a very beneficial way to dampen sound. And so that comes up a lot in the comments when I'm having conversations with people about green glue and stuff like that. And they ask questions like, oh, could I do this? Could I do that? And sometimes my answer is go read up on, constrained layer damping, because that's going to give you an idea of what green glue is actually doing. Those are all the helpful terms I could think of as you're doing research for your studio project. I am going to put out another video pretty soon all about standing waves and room modes and things like that to give you a little bit more detail on that topic, so stay tuned to that in the not too distant future. And that's going to do it for this video. I hope that you found it helpful and that it makes your research process in the future just a little bit easier. If it was useful to you, I'd appreciate it if you consider liking the video and subscribing to my channel, because this is the type of stuff that I love to tackle. And with that, I hope you have a great day, and I will see you on the next video.